This is a good time to ask this. What are we doing?
We're talking about Tiger King.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna put that in the video. I'm gonna publicly shame you.
Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. I'm Jess Barclay.
And I'm Cole, and I'm an attorney here at Althouse Law.
I'm also a paralegal. I didn't add that one in. And we're here to talk about...
Tiger King.
Kind of.
Kind of. I know we're a little bit behind the ball because the first season came out, about 2 years ago?
Yeah, around that time.
But the second season just came out, so back in the news. So why not, we'll talk about a little bit of estate planning around Tiger King, and more specifically...
Carole Baskin. We know you're waiting for the tea about Carole Baskin and the situation with Don Lewis. I personally don't believe that he was found, but magically he was. But we're going to be talking about if the situation that was all over the news, her feeding him to the tigers, was correct. We'll be talking about that.
And for those of you who don't know who Don Lewis is Carole's ex-husband. She since has a new husband who seems lovely. I guess people will have different opinions on that.
The leash gives me a different opinion about that one.
That's fair. Write down in the comments your opinion of her husband.
Best comment gets a shout out in the next video.
But let's dive into it. So let's dive into the scenario of Carole Baskin and the story behind her and Don Lewis and sort of what happened and why it sort of leads into this estate planning conversation. And so there's a huge theory out there that Carole Baskin actually fed her husband, Don Lewis, to her tigers on the sanctuary they have. But the real question is, well, apparently she received all of his money and things along those lines, but was she supposed to?
So our question as normal humans is, how did she do it?
And it sort of plays on your typical attorney answer, it depends. And so there is a statute out there called the Slayer Statute. And what this specifically says is that an individual, if they were to receive inheritance as a beneficiary from any individual, if they were responsible for their murder or their death, then they have no right to inherit anything. And so it really turns on whether or not Carole Baskin actually murdered Don Lewis and fed him to the tigers. If that were to be true, then she shouldn't have received anything. But what more likely than not happened, it was never legally proven that she did murder Don Lewis or feed him to the tigers. And so she did have a right to inherit under anything that he particularly owned. Obviously, it's going to be based on Florida law. We're talking about this generally based on Colorado. So a little bit differentiations in there of what she would actually receive versus what she would receive in the state of Colorado.
I'm still a firm believer that she murdered Don Lewis, and John Lewis is the one in Costa Rica talking and saying that he is Don Lewis. That's all. That's all I think.
There's John Lewis.
There's not a John Lewis, but apparently Don Lewis was found. Don Lewis was magically found after Tiger King 2 came out. They're like, oh yeah, we just talked to him in Costa Rica. He's fine. What?
Was this in Tiger King 2?
Yes. They're like, no, it wasn't in Tiger King 2. I Googled it after Tiger King 2.
So John Lewis is a name that you made up.
John Lewis is who is down in Costa Rica faking that he's Don Lewis.
Is that
trying to save Carole
Just
Baskin's
make up
ass.
that name?
100% just made it up.
Okay, it's like a John Doe situation.
No,
So
because
wait,
that's not him in Costa Rica. It's some dude that she paid off with the millions that she inherited to say that he's Don Lewis.
what if he died unrelated to her actions and she fed him to the tiger?
Yeah, and so if Don Lewis passed away from natural causes, she would still be, natural causes.
I think tigers are pretty natural.
If he died in another way, aside from being fed to tigers, and Carole Baskin had no part in it, whether natural or unnatural, then she would still be able to inherit, obviously depending on whether he had a will or an estate plan, anything along those lines. However, just based on statute, she would be entitled to a portion of the particular estate. Even if he passed away from any of those natural or unnatural causes, and then later, after he passed away, she fed him to the tigers, Slayer statute wouldn't apply. The main reason is Slayer focuses on if the individual was the person that ended up killing or murdering the actual individual. And so it doesn't have any bearing on whether the person died ahead of time and then was fed to tigers later.
I guess question on this one from a paralegal standpoint. Don Lewis had a bunch of kids. Carol got everything. He obviously didn't have an estate plan in place, did he?
No, and so that's an aspect that's important too, because if you don't have an estate plan and you own a large sum of assets, if those assets are held jointly with your significant other, they're going to go based on that. If they're held individually, in the state of Colorado, spouse, depending on who the children are, whether they're from the same marriage, whether they're from a previous marriage, spouse is going to be entitled to a certain amount of money from that particular estate. What's going to need to happen, though, is that estate will actually have to go through the probate process in order to actually transfer to anybody, which is a time-consuming, expensive, and stressful experience for most people. Some people enjoy it, but they become estate planning attorneys. And so in those scenarios, though, you must rather have an estate plan that lays out where you want your stuff to go, instead of having to go through probate and possibly your ex-wife who fed you to tigers getting everything that you own. So this has been Cole and Jess talking about Tiger King and its relation to estate planning. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Don't be like Carol Baskins or Basket. Don't be like Carol Baskin or Don Lewis. Get an estate plan.